Over the last couple of years, people have come to realize that when the World Economic Forum publishes a report talking about what will happen in the future, it's more of a promise than a prediction. Well, the WEF recently released a report which details the risks the world will soon face, according to 13,000 of the most powerful people on the planet. It's safe to say that the crises they forecast are hugely concerning. So today, I'm going to summarize the WEF's Global Risks Report for 2023, explain what it all means, and tell you how you can prepare for the WEF's upcoming Polycrisis. So, the WEF's Global Risks Report for 2023 begins with a brief preface by WEF Managing Director Sadia Zahidi. She discusses how carbon emissions have increased because pandemic restrictions have been dropped and blames the energy crisis, the food crisis, and soaring inflation on the war in Ukraine. If you watched our video about ESG and cryptocurrency, you'll know that the energy crisis began long before the war in Ukraine and is the consequence of the ESG ideology that was invented by the WEF. The ESG-induced energy crisis is causing inflation too, though the war in Ukraine is also contributing. Note that Russian President Vladimir Putin was once one of the WEF's young global leaders. Food for thought. Sadia then notes that, quote, "The resulting shift in monetary policy marks the end of an economic era defined by easy access to cheap debt and will have vast ramifications for governments, companies, and individuals, widening inequality within and between countries." Sadia goes on to explain that the world is quickly deglobalizing and that only a few countries have the capacity to be truly independent. She also reveals that this is the 18th edition of the WEF's Global Risks Report. And note that you can find a link to the full report in the description. Now, regarding the so-called polycrisis, Sadia says this will be caused primarily by, quote, "shortages in natural resources such as food, water and metals, and minerals." She concludes by saying that this year's edition of the Global Risks Report is a call to action to prevent this polycrisis. Now, the second part of the report details its methodology. The WEF got one part of the information for the report from 1,200 of its so-called experts from all areas of the economy. The report specifies that the opinions of these so-called experts were gathered between September and October, just FYI. The report also specifies that the WEF got the other part of the information for the report from the WEF's Executive Opinion Survey, which includes over 12,000 business leaders in 121 countries. As for the report itself, it was written by 40 WEF members and 50 other powerful people. The author, or rather authors, then provide a definition for the term global risk. Quote, "The possibility of the occurrence of an event or condition which, if it occurs, would negatively impact a significant proportion of global GDP, population, or natural resources. The more you know." So, the third part of the report provides a summary of its findings. Summarizing the summary might sound redundant, but I've read enough of these reports to know that you do occasionally come across important information that isn't entirely evident in the report itself. The authors start by saying that the new normal of the pandemic was quickly disrupted by another crisis, which is, of course, the war in Ukraine. What's interesting is that the authors talk about the pandemic as if it's over. Now, in case you missed the memo, we're still technically in a pandemic. And, as it so happens, the World Health Organization is supposed to decide whether or not the pandemic is over on the 27th of January. If they decide that the pandemic is indeed over, then it may be evidence that the WEF was aware of this in advance. This wouldn't be surprising given the WEF's activities shortly before the pandemic. More about those in the description. The authors then go on to list all the issues the world is facing today, including, quote, unsustainable levels of debt, a new era of low growth, low global investment and deglobalization, a decline in human development after decades of progress, and every other horrible thing you can think of. The authors then provide this infographic, which shows the issues that the WEF's experts are concerned about over the next 2 years and over the next 10 years. As you can see, the cost of living crisis, natural disasters, and economic war are at the top of the list for the 2-year time horizon, whereas environmental-related issues are at the top of the list for the 10-year time horizon. The authors reveal that the polycrisis caused by the shortage in resources will coincidentally hit its peak in 2030. Now, I say coincidentally because 2030 is the deadline that the WEF and its affiliates have set for total world domination. What better way to do this than through successive manufactured crises? Anyway, speculation aside, the authors then warn that central banks around the world will likely be fighting inflationary forces for the next 2 years. The resulting monetary policy, i.e. high interest rates, will do the most damage to developing countries, risking a collapse of these countries and mass migration. While the wars we're going to see will be mostly economic, the authors seem to imply that China could soon invade Taiwan. This makes sense given that Western countries are setting up their own microchip manufacturing, which makes Taiwan less geopolitically important and therefore more open to capture. To lessen the likelihood of straight-up shooting wars, the authors call for global controls to be imposed on the production and movement of weapons. Something tells me that they forgot about the fact that weapons will inevitably be easy for anyone to manufacture using 3D printers. Seriously, look it up. Anyways, the authors tacitly confirm that the technologies the WEF and its affiliates are developing will be designed to control the population. That's because the authors claim that any countries that do not have access to these technologies will fall victim to misinformation, the ultimate elite buzzword. The authors also predict that there will be, quote, attacks against agriculture and water, financial systems, public security, transport, energy and domestic, space and undersea communication infrastructure. Note that the WEF has recently been talking a lot about these targeted cyberattacks. Say, did you know that a cyberattack is a great way to justify digital ID online? Probably nothing. Now, the authors go on to argue that a failure to address the climate crisis means that crises such as the upcoming shortage in natural resources will be much worse. What the authors fail to mention is that governments have had the power to modify the weather for decades and are getting damn good at it. More about that in the description. Moving on. When it comes to the cost of living crisis, the authors note, quote, associated social unrest and political instability will not be contained to emerging markets, as economic pressures continue to hollow out the middle income bracket. In other words, the only two economic categories will be rich and poor. The silver lining is that 4 in 5 of the experts at the WEF believe that most of the damage they describe will be done over the next 2 years. Half of them believe that these issues will be resolved by the end of the decade, probably because they truly believe the WEF and Co. will achieve total control. Next, the authors provide an impressive infographic which basically shows you how all these different crises will be connected. According to the WEF, the most important crises will be collapse of supply chains, erosion of social cohesion, and state collapse. Sounds like they know they're losing control. This ties into another infographic which reveals that the participants in the WEF's report believe that the powers that be are unprepared to address misinformation and disinformation. They recommend that governments act now, and if you watched our video about online censorship, you'll know that's exactly what they're doing. Anywho, the fourth part of the report is aptly titled, quote, Today's Crisis, and it includes everything you would expect. Energy crisis, cost of living crisis, and rising inflation are noted by the WEF's experts as being the most important. I suspect this is because these crises destroy people's trust in the elites. Funnily enough, the pandemic is noted as one of the least important crises, which again suggests they know what the WHO will decide. Once upon a time, the pandemic was what the WEF was all about, but they've since moved on to other events. I cannot wait to find out which crises they come up with next. In all seriousness, the authors refer to these crises as, quote, older risks that were faced by previous generations. However, they caution that these old crises are intertwined with new risks such as high levels of debt, lots of technological innovation, and an increasing skepticism of WEF-like institutions. The authors then break down some of today's crises in more detail. For cost of living, they caution that energy prices will likely remain 50% higher than last year and say that China's reopening could lead to a surge in energy-driven inflation. This will cause central banks to keep interest rates higher for longer. What's scary is that the authors reveal that the cost of living crisis has caused mass protests in 92 countries. This is scary because I don't think I've heard about more than a few of these protests. This underlines the fact that the people in power are more desperate than ever to keep the narrative under control. For the ongoing economic downturn, the authors drop another disturbing statistic. Quote, inflation rates rose above 80% in Argentina and Turkey, while Zimbabwe, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Lebanon, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Sudan witnessed triple-digit inflation. Now, this obviously puts the low double-digit inflation we've seen in Western countries into perspective. But then again, the official inflation statistics we're being given may not be that accurate. You can learn why the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, might be incorrect by using the link in the description. Back to the WEF. Now, the authors go on to explain that the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, expects global inflation to drop from 9% in 2022 to 6.4% in 2023 and further decline to 4.1% in 2024. The authors note that this slowdown in inflation will be felt the most in developed countries, but caution that unemployment could keep it high. For context, the Federal Reserve and other Western central banks are concerned that a continuation of low unemployment will continue to push wages higher. Higher wages means more inflation for longer. This is why the Fed is essentially pushing for a recession and why it might be deeper than most expect. The authors also caution that keeping interest rates higher for longer in developed countries could cause issues in developing countries, notably for their governments. In short, money is moving out of emerging market government bonds, risking a spike in interest rates that could cause defaults. The authors then have the audacity to claim that this dynamic is what caused Sri Lanka to collapse. In reality, Sri Lanka collapsed because it was trying to implement the WEF's ESG policies on a national scale. The result was effectively a shortage of everything. More about what happened there in the description. Now, as for the geo-economic warfare we're witnessing, the authors state that the unprecedented sanctions against Russia sent a clear message to any country that opposes Western interests. Your assets will be seized by Western governments. It appears that this hostility is even occurring between allies, as the authors rightfully point out that the US President's ironically titled Inflation Reduction Act is incentivizing some companies in the EU to relocate to the US. Some of you may recall that the Digital Markets Act was the EU's response to this obvious overreach. The authors caution that this situation will, quote, likely continue to weaken existing alliances as nations turn inwards with enhanced state intervention perceived to drive a race to the bottom. They even warn that global organizations such as the WHO will be weaponized for geopolitical purposes. I reckon that's already happening, but that is a topic for another time. As for the climate crisis, meanwhile, the authors say that there's been a, quote, divergence between what is scientifically necessary and what is politically expedient. They go as far as criticising Europe for turning to fossil fuels when it faced imminent energy shortages, which is a bit ridiculous. It also reveals that intermittent energy sources aren't going to cut it, but that's yet another topic for yet another time. Now, I couldn't help but notice how the authors note the Netherlands as the country that's most concerned about commitment to arbitrary and ever-changing climate goals. This stuck out because the Dutch government recently announced it would be buying up and closing down 3,000 family farms. The government claims this is because of the climate crisis, but I suspect it has more to do with the tri-state city that the Netherlands is building in partnership with the UN. Setting up the city won't be possible if there are family farms in the way. And on that note, it looks like one of those 15-minute cities. More about that dystopian idea in the description. Now, where was I? Oh yes, when it comes to the societal polarization we're seeing, the authors seem to assert that it lies at the core of all the other crises we're currently experiencing and could experience. After all, if everyone would just shut up and listen to the WEF and its young global leaders, then everything would be solved overnight. Not surprisingly, the authors blame the free sharing of information, stating, quote, "This is further amplified by social media, which increases polarization and distrust in institutions alongside political engagement." To the WEF, this free sharing of information is just misinformation and disinformation. The authors also acknowledge that, quote, "Regulatory constraints and educational efforts will likely fail to keep pace, and its impact will expand with the more widespread usage of automation and machine learning technologies, from bots that imitate human-written text to deepfakes of politicians." If you watched our video about ChatGPT, you'll know that OpenAI is trying to prevent its powerful technology from being used by the kinds of people that the WEF doesn't like. One of OpenAI's possible prevention methods is to force everyone to complete KYC to use social media and such. No thanks. Anywho, because today's crises aren't terrifying enough for the WEF to control the population, the fifth part of the report talks about, quote, tomorrow's catastrophes, which might just do the trick. You'll recall that the top catastrophes have to do with the weather, which governments can in fact influence. The authors group these long-term catastrophes into 5 categories: natural ecosystems, human health, human security, digital rights, and economic stability. The authors stress that these categories are not exhaustive and they can be used as templates for how to prepare for other upcoming crises. For natural ecosystems, the authors state that humans have disturbed the natural balance of nature, which is a bit funny considering that humans are a part of nature too, but, well, we know what they're getting at. Certain elements of human life have gone to extremes, and this is doing damage to the environment. If you watched our video about how inflation is destroying everything, you'll know that it's overconsumption which is causing these environmental issues, and that this overconsumption is being incentivized by inflation. A return to a hard money system based on gold or Bitcoin would help fix this. But ending inflation, that is, money creation, means that the WEF and its friends would have to give up their positions of power, which they are unsurprisingly unwilling to do. As such, the only solution, in their eyes, is to control what you consume and where you can go, while they go on living their lives without these restrictions. If that wasn't frustrating enough, consider the following. Quote, land use change remains the most prolific threat to nature, according to many experts. Agriculture and animal farming alone take up more than 35% of Earth's terrestrial surface and are the biggest direct drivers of wildlife decline globally. Moreover, quote, the ongoing crisis in the affordability and availability of food supplies positions efforts to conserve and restore terrestrial biodiversity at odds with domestic food security. Now, this is patently false because more farm animals could in fact potentially be part of the solution to climate change. More about that in the description, and be sure you watch that video when you get a moment. Now, what's insane is that the authors suggest forgiving the debt owed by developing countries in exchange for their land so that it can be conserved. The authors admit that this would create serious food security challenges in these countries, but don't really seem to care all that much about this side effect. For what it's worth, the authors acknowledge that the mining of the minerals required to make things like electric vehicles and massive batteries for intermittent energy sources is extremely damaging to the environment and could disrupt ecosystems. It's too bad that they seem to shrug off this side effect too. The authors also discuss the issuance of carbon credits, which I discussed at length in another video, and of course you know where to find it, down below. Now, for human health, the authors pitch the possibility of permanent pandemics, which I'm sure the WEF would love to see. As a fun fact, research has shown that pandemics tend to occur every time there's a solar minimum when the sun is shining the least. This is because it lowers vitamin D levels globally. Guess when the last solar minimum was? That's right, around 2020. I wonder if the WEF knew that. Anyway, conspiracy theories aside, the authors can't help but insist that much of the human health issues we're going to see will be related to climate change. And of course, they claim that all these issues will ultimately be due to disinformation and misinformation causing distrust in evidently untrustworthy authorities. For human security, the authors highlight the concerns that the WEF's experts have about internal conflicts. Surprisingly, they don't seem to be all that worried about international conflicts further out in the future. I suppose they reckon we'll be too busy fighting our neighbours. Even so, the authors caution that the recent resurgence in militarization could set the stage for international conflicts. This is a spooky take when you couple it with this chart, which shows China's military research and development pumping like a meme coin, with the US's crashing like a shitcoin. If you're wondering what weapons governments are building, the authors cover anti-satellite and hypersonic weapons, directed energy weapons, and quantum computers. It is insane to consider that directed energy weapons were once a conspiracy theory, just like weather modification. Speaking of which, the authors stop short of suggesting that hostile countries are actively using weather modification weapons against each other. But they do predict that so-called rogue actors will eventually get their hands on these kind of advanced weapons, be they individuals or organised groups. Maybe the cast of Stranger Things if they go off the rails. Who knows? Sorry. Anyway, moving on from that incredibly lame joke, when it comes to digital rights, the authors point to the ever-increasing erosion of privacy as being the primary issue. The ironic thing is that the WEF doesn't seem to want the average person to have privacy. Rather, they want to make sure their constituents have privacy while they make massive profits from our data. Case in point, the authors confirm that, quote, individuals will be targeted and monitored by the public and private sector to an unprecedented degree, often without adequate anonymity or consent. Most of the people who run these institutions in the public and private sectors are part of the WEF. If that wasn't bad enough, quote, this pattern will only be enhanced by the metaverse, which could collect and track even more sensitive data, including facial expressions, gait, vital signs, brainwave patterns, and vocal inflections. According to the WEF's research, the poor will love the metaverse. But wait, there's more. Quote, research suggests that 99.98% of US residents could be correctly re-identified in any dataset, including those that are heavily sampled and anonymized. Put simply, these systems are so advanced that they can identify you even if the info isn't directly linked to your identity. As far as the authors are concerned, this is fine because, quote, the right to privacy is not absolute. It is traded off against government surveillance and preventative policing for the purposes of national security. To be fair, they do admit that this justification can, and often does, go too far. When it comes to economic stability, the authors underscore the aforementioned debt crises that many countries are facing due to rising interest rates. What's funny is that the authors seem to be hoping for a recession because it will cause central banks to lower interest rates, which will reduce the debt default risk. They point to the UK's gilt market as an example of what could happen elsewhere if interest rates don't come down soon, and you can find out what happened to UK gilts using, of course, the link in the description. Now, what's crazy is that the authors reveal that China has become the world's largest creditor. In plain English, China owns more of everyone's debt than anyone else. This is in large part due to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has seen the country give infrastructure loans to developing countries. The authors caution that the credit crunch currently being experienced by many countries means that they'll be less able to spend money on building out public infrastructure. This will further contribute to the other issues mentioned so far, hence why the authors are so obsessed with the term polycrisis. This relates to the sixth part of the report, which pertains to the possible outcomes of this polycrisis. And the authors commence by finally providing a clear definition of polycrisis. Quote, "A cluster of related global risks with compounding effects, such that the overall impact exceeds the sum of each part." What's hilarious is that the authors admit that the polycrisis, which will again be caused primarily by a shortage of natural resources, is due in large part to the United Nations' Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which member countries of the UN are expected to achieve by 2030. There's that date again. Now, as for the possible outcomes of this polycrisis, the authors define four. The first is resource collaboration, the second is resource constraints, the third is resource competition, and the fourth is resource control. The authors set the timeline for these possible outcomes for 2030. This is getting old. Now, for resource collaboration, the outcome sounds like what's happening now. Countries cooperate, but the real shortage of natural resources causes inflation to continue, which leads to lots of the same issues the authors have discussed so far. Resource constraints are the same outcome, but worse. As for resource competition, the outcome sounds like what many analysts have predicted. Countries decide to reshore their supply chains in an attempt to become self-sufficient. The outcome of resource control, meanwhile, is pretty self-explanatory. Countries fight each other for resources to become self-sufficient. What's ironic is that the authors admit that the imperative of protecting the environment is at odds with strip mining the planet for materials to make EVs and batteries. What's sad is that there's almost no mention of nuclear energy anywhere in this report. It's only mentioned in passing, not as a true topic. Now, besides precious metals and minerals, the authors are also concerned about water. And, come to think of it, most of the natural resource shortages they claim would occur could easily be solved by not having to rely on intermittent energy sources like wind and solar. Somehow, this isn't an option. I wonder if that's because most solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries are made in China. This can be clearly seen on the infographic the authors so kindly provide, where China plays a role at every step of the green energy rollout. Consider that countries could create nuclear power sources without having to rely on China, but then the WEF wouldn't have centralized control of all the world's energy. To clarify, China doesn't have all the minerals the WEF needs to create its centralized smart grids and cities. It's countries like the DRC, Turkey, Chile, Australia, and South Africa that hold all the cards. The authors caution that there will be an intense power struggle for the resources in these regions. Nuclear would be so much easier, and yet it's somehow not an option, despite the recent breakthrough with fusion. Now, this brings me to the seventh and final part of the report, the conclusion. The authors begin by repeating that we're entering a, quote, low growth, low investment, and low cooperation era. They recommend that the readers at the WEF do 4 things to prepare for the upcoming polycrisis. The first is to improve risk identification. The authors seem to imply that the people in power should try to crush dissent when it comes to identifying future risks. They also call for the establishment of global organizations that will keep track of future risks and tell countries how they ought to address them. The second is to rethink future risks. By this, the authors mean that the people in power should try and minimize the coverage of real-time risks that pertain to the average person. Instead, they should try and push people to become obsessed with future risks that have yet to occur, like climate catastrophes. The third is to invest in preparedness, which is self-explanatory. The authors reveal that the United States, the United Kingdom, and others are preparing to pass laws which will mandate that public and private institutions prepare for any kind of crisis that could occur over the next 30 years. I wonder why. Now, the fourth is to cooperate with other powerful individuals and institutions in the public and private sectors. The authors complain that international cooperation is deteriorating and urge countries not to become self-sufficient. Rather, they should become reliant on each other, especially on China. I added that last bit, obviously. So, how can you prepare for the WEF's upcoming polycrisis? Well, it seems that the answer is to do the opposite of whatever the WEF wants. I'll reiterate that the shortages in natural resources that lie at the core of this polycrisis are themselves rooted in the WEF's ESG obsessions, as per the author's admissions. And if you watched our video about how to survive the Great Reset, you'll know that ESG is the way that the private sector is pushing the UN's SDGs. I predict that the SDGs will fail because of an upcoming financial crisis, the same way the UN's Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, failed because of 2008. That said, there's no denying that there are very real issues in the world that need to be addressed. The concerns that the WEF's correspondents have are very real and very valid. The problem is that they want to centralize control of the entire system to ensure it doesn't collapse, but that's not the solution. The solution is to decentralize, well, everything. We can start by decentralizing money with cryptocurrency. This cryptocurrency should be hard money like gold to incentivize saving instead of spending, which will eliminate the overconsumption destroying the environment. Bitcoin is a good fit. Then we can decentralize energy with nuclear power and accelerate the development of fusion power. After that, we must decentralize information. Everything should be as open source as possible, and it should be possible to get information about the same issue or event from multiple sources. No more coordinated censorship by the trifecta of big tech, the mainstream media, and governments. Voting systems should be publicly verifiable too. This can already be done today, but governments won't allow this degree of transparency for some unexplained reason. I mean, it's not like our democratic systems have been hijacked by a corrupt elite or anything. Now, when it comes to food production and water security, you'll recall my comment about it being possible to combat climate change using farm animals. The TLDR is to have farm animals graze as they did historically. This can turn literal deserts into oases, resulting in more food and more water. Seriously, watch that video. So, with sound money, near infinite energy, uncensored information, and plenty of food and water, it would become possible to do anything. More importantly, it would become possible to overcome any crisis the WEF and its cronies could predict or promise. That is the world I want, and it's the one I fight for. Oh, and in case you were wondering, yes, the report did mention crypto, but only once and in the appendix. It's on the list of risks by alphabetical order under Asset Bubble. I guess the so-called experts at the WEF don't know that the crypto market crashed, or maybe they're still planning something.